All right, welcome, folks. Today we're talking about families and children, and this continues a significant exploration of themes and trends with respect to marriage and family in the United States. First off, in terms of themes and trends, uh, we can begin with lower fertility. Generally, American families today have roughly two children on average, down from just about four children per family right after the Second World War going into the mid 1960s. And so, this lower fertility historically that we're in presently is consistent with the total fertility rate, or the number of children born to the average woman, again, which is about two children per woman. Also, in terms of trends, we have to take a closer look at greater diversity. We currently consider a greater range of household types as families than we did in the past, such as blended families with step parents, step siblings, gay and lesbian families, and unmarried couples with children. Also encompassing this diversity includes circumstances alongside where you have a greater share of adults spending larger portions of their lives without children. So that also is part of that dynamic diversity with respect to families in the United States. Also, single parent families are equally dynamic. 40% of all children in our country are born to unmarried parents. And so the process of becoming a single parent has also changed. It's shifted, and there's greater diversity with respect to that. So there are young adults who are at a point in life where they just don't consider themselves ready for marriage. You also have older women who've planned to be single mothers, and you also have singles who are divorced and are very unlikely to remarry yet again. So again, those are just a good sort of smattering of examples of themes and trends that this chapter is sort of anchored by. We also need to talk about population processes, and we think of this within the social sciences and sociology as demography. And so we'll talk about them in terms of race and ethnicity, education, and social class and economics, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity. In terms of race and ethnicity, total fertility rates in single parenthood, they vary. They change according to race and ethnicity and culture. So for African American and Latinx women, they are disproportionately more likely to bear more children on average. And African American and Latinx and Native American families are more likely to be headed by a single parent versus white and Asian American families. And this is due to, I should say, several reasons. Cultural expectations, lower levels of education, lower access to contraceptives and healthcare. Populations of color are also younger overall, and their fertility rates tend to be higher in former homeland countries. And so that explains the greater tendency towards childbearing among African American and Latinx women. Also, economic instability for less educated African American and Latinx and Native American men, that has greatly contributed to the growth of single parent families within those communities as well. And so we talked about that in the context of deindustrialization, the changing structure of the nation's job market, going largely from manufacturing, sort of lower skill, higher pay positions to service oriented jobs and service oriented economics that tend to favor those who have degrees or specialized forms of training and education. Also, in terms of demography, we have to get this is a good point to cue that up and talk about education. Generally, with respect to education, women with less education, they tend to have more children on average. And so this is consistent with limited opportunities for women educationally and occupationally. Women with four-year degrees or more tend to have fewer children, and they tend to have children toward the end of their childbearing years. And so that's consistent with their ability to prioritize and the privilege they have to do so to prioritize higher education. Also, we can't leave out social class and the economy and economics. So, in terms of planning and unplanning, or the planned and unplanned pregnancy, if we think of it in terms of that, in context of the question of social class, unplanned and unintended pregnancies are much more common amongst poor and working class women with less than a four-year degree. And again, that's consistent with some of the trends and some of the themes we had talked about before, such as less access to medical care, contraception, and health education. Often poor families, according to the research, shows that they may lack the motivation to prevent pregnancy, yet many poor women believe at the same time that having their children saved them, that having kids provided a life of purpose, it encouraged healthier, less riskier behavior, and goal setting for the future. And for gay and lesbian families, research generally overwhelmingly shows no greater systemic difficulties for children raised in such families compared to straight families. Indeed, there's greater commitment to parenting ideals among gay and lesbian families who spend more quality time with their children, according to the research, than do straight couples. All right. Now, also, we need to talk about adoption. So, adoption has, in a sense, a three-pronged path, or that there's a set of pathways that are unique with respect to the entirety of adoption. One path includes those who are adopted through the foster care system. Also, another path includes U.S. born children who are adopted through private adoption services, and then those who are internationally born and adopted here in the United States. Compared to prior generations and decades, uh, adoption is much more openly discussed and much less stigmatized than in the past. So the stigma that we're seeing having gone away is also associated with the lessening of the stigma of being an unwed mother. So with the unwed mother stigma having waned and the wider availability of contraception, again, adoption is much, much less negatively judged or stigmatized. Most adoptions include an agreement to put children in touch or in some kind of contact with their biological parents, and the vast majority of adopted children greatly appreciate these experiences, according to the research. Also, abortion and infertility. Abortion generally is just, in terms of the research, just under 20% of pregnancies in a given year terminated in an abortion within the first 3 months of pregnancy. That may or may not seem like a lot, but again, we need to look at it in historical context. Research shows that we are performing fewer abortions, significantly fewer than in the past. Abortion rates were at their highest in 1980 at about 29 per 1,000 women, and now they've been at just under half that since 2014. Research shows that poor and working class women of color in their 20s are much more likely to have abortions, which is consistent with their lack of power and privilege within society as an aggregate. Fewer abortions over time are consistent with expanded opportunities for women and greater access to contraception. Infertility, and so by definition, and the definitions of it can be a bit loose, but generally we're looking at having experienced at least a year of deliberate non-contraceptive sex without conception. Roughly 6% of U.S. married couples experience infertility at any given time. It's much more common amongst those who are older and in poor health, but also smoking, obesity, and a past history of sexually transmitted infections are also risk factors for infertility. Among women, those with less education, African American, and Latinx populations are more likely to experience infertility, again, largely due to health disparities. And so populations that are disproportionately more likely to suffer from poverty are also much more likely to be beset with the challenges of infertility. Now we need to talk a bit about parenting and the functions of parenting, sort of what parenting does for society. And a lot of this goes back to the functionalist perspective within sociology, where the functionalists kind of look at how things work and they tinker around with things. They look at how society operates generally smoothly and has consistency and coherency in one system and from one system to another. And so families being institutions and part of institutional structures are, again, a system wherein we can look at, well, what exactly do families, what do they do for society? What do they accomplish for society? Families provide us socialization. They provide society social experiences and children social experiences within the family. They get from that the skills for adult life, including adaptation, or rather adaptation, I should say, teamwork, and accountability. So they learn from within the family how to adapt to changing circumstances, not just within the family, of course, but they practice that adaptation within the family so that they can do it later on outside the family. So a lot of what happens in family is what we really refer to in sociology as anticipatory socialization. And so you're engaging rather in all of this learning that's intended for future statuses and roles. And so that's a big part of what socialization ultimately amounts to for all of us. Also, another function of family is that families give us emotional bonds. Uh, Family experiences we have over time, they help us form emotional connections between children, siblings, and parents. So we have these cognitive, these mental, and these emotional connections to be used in how we form future relationships beyond the family. Also, social networks, families give us that. They give us a good step up, a jump into those kinds of things. Interactions within the family facilitate additional social networks beyond the family in the form of play dates, celebratory gatherings for birthdays, bar and bat mitzvahs and the like, New Year's and things like that, and additional adult role models we get through the social networks that families ultimately and parenting ultimately provides via the family. There are things that parents do per the research that are very strongly linked to successful outcomes for children. So research generally demonstrates children's success in three major life dimensions. And so if we look at happiness, doing well in school, and staying out of trouble, so a lot of that is tied to parental involvement in three key areas. Number one, how supportive a parent is, how much time they're actively spending with children, in a way that is engaging, in a way that involves either work, play, or just being available to that child. Also, the ability to monitor children, and so how much parents do that. This includes providing boundaries, setting reasonable limits on child and adolescent behavior, and again, for the goal of healthy development, not just having some sort of watching of children just for the sake of doing it, but that it actually means something, that it has a goal that it's attached to and that it's significant. And of course, discipline. So with discipline, we're looking at reasonable consequences for inappropriate behavior that, when they're applied, they also foster a sense of security in children. So if that three sort of pronged approach is there, the supportiveness, the ability to monitor and to discipline meaningfully children, if it's there, then that does tend to be associated, correlated with happiness, doing well in school, and staying out of trouble. And so those are things that we can use in a practical sense to help our families. And we certainly don't want to leave out fatherhood. And so with this discussion of fatherhood, we're looking at a lot of the changing structures within society, how we've gone from being, if you will, industrial to now post-industrial. And so during the industrial period, again, when machine technologies, smokestack industries were big, the fatherhood ideal that was big, that prevailed, was the provider ideal of fatherhood. And so this has long been historically the dominant conception of what fatherhood and consequently what men should aspire to. And so it really involves men and dads being a financial provider and an authority figure for the children, and hewing largely to that provision aspect, that it's about bringing the money in and in bringing the money in, excuse me, to the family, and bringing resources into the family. So sort of a singular, single-minded kind of approach and goal. And again, a lot of this reflects, again, the overwhelming dominance that men had financially, with respect to the economy, and in respect, or with respect to wage earning. As women have become a greater proportion of the workforce, wage earning becoming normative amongst women, and the ideals of childhood changing from children being an economic sort of opportunity to an emotional opportunity. This is where the involved father ideal starts to come into the fore and starts to prevail. And so that's really where we are today. The involved father ideal really evolved during the post-industrial changing, if you will, of the job market, where we left manufacturing to a fair extent behind, and now services are a bigger part of what we do in terms of how we work. So again, with post-industrial, we're talking about after the industrial period. We're really looking at the period from the 1950s into the present, where this involved father ideal has emerged. So this involves dads being there emotionally, being able to nurture, and having a ability to form and perform companionship bonds with their children, in addition to being providers. And so this is a much more egalitarian type role and approach, but also a much more multifactorial approach and role with respect to how children are raised vis-a-vis fathers. Again, overwhelmingly, the research shows that men, as fathers, want to have, at least two-thirds want to have that nurturing emotional component to their fatherhood, and that far dwarfs their sense of how much it's important to be a provider. So only about 6% of men today consider that that's the major role that they should have as being providers. And so again, we've made a significant amount of change in our society with respect to not only, of course, the economy, but just simply how families work and what the mechanics of families are when fathers are involved and when fathers are engaged indeed within family. Research also shows within straight families that we're seeing men much more engaged in domestic tasks, much more engaged, of course, with those things, probably as a result of that embrace of the involved father ideal.